So this brings us to our fourth segment in the digital diagnostics series, and this one's titled How to Take Good Photos with Your Camera. As we learn a little bit about how to take good photos with our camera, we'll see that a lot of this information might be similar or a review from our last video on how to take good photos with your phone. But we will go over some specific tricks that are only found on a point and shoot and other style camera, and something you wouldn't have to worry about or think about when shooting photos with your phone. So to start off, I want to talk about why we would use a traditional camera versus using your phone, since a phone is so readily available. Well, a traditional camera offers some advantages that a phone doesn't have. So for example, a traditional camera will offer a higher quality image. So it might be a more crisp or clear image. You may be able to get better close-up images with a traditional camera. And then also there's a lot more settings in a traditional camera that once you get really good at using, you can take better photos without having to edit them later for contrast, color, lighting, and things like that. And then you can also take better photos from a distance. The zoom on a traditional camera works a little bit differently. So rather than just pulling that image closer like what happens on the phone, this is actually changing the distance of the camera lens to get a better photo. But there are some disadvantages to a traditional camera, and one of the main things is cost. So they are more expensive, and if it's not something you readily have available to you, it might not be something you can use to take diagnostic photos. And then there's also a time commitment to learning how to use all the settings and being able to use your camera to the best of its ability. These settings can be very complex. Some of the point and shoot cameras are fairly simple, but it does still take a little bit of a learning curve to be able to understand how to use it. And then often with a lot of cameras, you have to go back to a computer to upload your pictures. Though there are some cameras that automatically upload them through Wi-Fi to a computer, you still have to have another device to be able to edit, look at, and send your photos. So here's just a brief review of some of the tips that applied to taking good photos with a phone, but also apply to taking good photos with a camera. One of the main ones is avoid taking through a screen or a dirty window or something like this, because it can inhibit the clarity of the image. And also use a light source other than a flash. Natural light is really, really good for taking pictures in comparison to other sources. And then you can also use other lights like lamps, book lights, or anything where you can direct the light source to get the best photo that you want. And also, as with a phone, use something to steady your hands. Cameras have a lot of good tools like tripods that you can use, but you can use something as simple as an object to steady your hands on, or a stand, or anything else that'll help take a more clear picture. Now we'll talk about a couple of things that are specific to using a traditional camera. So one of the first things is edit the stabilization settings on the camera, especially if you don't have a tripod or a stand to steady your shot. So for example, this might be something like putting it to an in motion setting, especially if you're trying to take a photo of an insect that's moving. And this setting can help you get a clearer shot. And you can see here, if I edit the stabilization settings, if I'm moving around a lot, the photo on the left is a little bit blurry. But if I have the stabilization settings on, the photo on the right is a lot clearer. Another function to change on your camera to get a good photo, especially for pictures that are really close up, is to use the macro mode. So for example, the photo here on the left is a little blurry, and it was taken in your traditional settings or your automatic function on your camera. And then the photo on the right was taken in macro mode, where you get a really nice, crisp picture with all the details of this insect wing. Cameras also have some really useful settings to manually adjust the exposure of your image, but it's important to do this before you take the photo and when you're out wherever you are taking your image of your thing for diagnostics. So for example, the photo here on the left was prior to adjusting the exposure, and then you can see a much clearer image of the plant here on the right, where we adjusted the exposure to account for how bright and sunny it was outside. Traditional cameras also have a little bit more range in being able to manually adjust the focus than you would have on a phone. So instead of using autofocus on your camera, you can play around with the manual focus to get a better image. And this might be because the autofocus is picking up too much in the background, so what you want to actually see for diagnostics isn't being shown very well. And you can see this in the photo on the left, where using the autofocus, it really picked up on that mulch in the background of the flower. But then on the photo on the right, using manual focus, I was able to get a much more clearer image of the flower itself. As we mentioned before, one of the advantages to using a traditional camera is being able to use zoom a little bit more freely. So in a traditional camera, the zoom is a true zoom lens. So it's an optical zoom, whereas on the phone, it's just enhancing the image by pulling and like zooming in on that image rather than changing the distance of the lens from the item you're trying to take a photo of. So if you're trying to take a photo from far away to get a really clear photo of something fairly small, you're going to want to use a traditional camera. So you can see here that we had a picture from further away, and then using the zoom function, we still have a lot of clarity in that picture on the right where we zoom in. This wouldn't necessarily be the case for a phone. You would get that granular appearance in the zoomed in picture. So that brings us to the end of our video on how to take good photos with a camera. So we've covered quite a bit, but mostly it was a review of how to take good photos with your phone, which tips can also apply to using a traditional camera. And then we looked at some of the more advanced settings that a traditional camera has to offer. But it's important to note sometimes it takes some learning and going through a camera manual before you're able to properly use all the settings available. And there's a lot more than what I mentioned today. And if you're really into photography, you can get into a lot of the nitty-gritty details of using a camera to the best of its ability. However, for the purpose of diagnostics, these are the main tools that we would use to get a crisp photo that can help your diagnostician diagnose your plant problem. Up next, we're going to be talking about DDIS, which is the distance diagnostics and identification system that we use through the University of Florida so that you can submit your photos now that you have great photos and that we can get you answers.